by. We're about to begin. Good day and welcome to the BSA, RBAC, and Access Control Best Practices webinar. Today's conference is being recorded. At this time, I would like to turn the call over to Mike Fiella. Please go ahead.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you all for joining. We have Sean Berry, Customer Evangelist, on the line to present what is now the 7th session of our BSA Best Practices. This session will cover RBAC and Access Control Best Practices and Use Cases. So please go ahead and start, Sean.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and hello into the future for those of us who are joining us from the recording. Today we're going to talk about role-based access control, which is one of the most powerful parts of BladeLogic, but unfortunately also can be one of the most confusing parts of BladeLogic. So we're going to talk today about how to use RBAC, what the best practices are, what the parts are, how to put them to work, and a bunch of common use cases that are kind of considered good things to know and things that will come up often and will help you solve problems using BladeLogic in your own environment. So we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about the objects themselves. We're going to talk about how they're implemented, and then we're going to get into use cases. And we're going to talk about, both some fairly basic use cases and then some fairly advanced use cases. And time permitting, if we have it at the end of it, we're going to go take a tour through the GUI and go see where some of those objects are. Maybe we'll get some screenshots into the deck for people after the fact. But we're going to go cover through this. We're probably going to move pretty quickly on this, but feel free to ask questions as we go. We have a number of great panelists answering Q&A, so feel free to ask questions in Q&A. Don't send them directly to me or to the host because neither of us are going to be able to answer them during the call. But if you want to put things into Q&A, that's a great place to do it. All right, awesome. So at a high level, we need to understand a couple of specific phrases, right? And so the two words that are most important for access control are authentication. How do you know that I am who I say I am? So all of us probably carry some kind of photo ID for interacting with various government agencies, operating motor vehicle, that sort of thing, maybe a passport for getting across borders. And that's basically how we authenticate, right? And on computer systems, we'll most commonly use passwords or, RSA tokens, something that combined with a personal identification number lets us interact with an organization to tell them who we are. And then authorization basically says what you're allowed to do, right? So my driver's license has a letter on it that basically says that I can drive cars, but not tractor trailers, right? My passport, let's see. So that's authorizations, basically, what am I allowed to do? So within BladeLogic, operator, we do have one participant who's still got hold music on the call. So looking at the list of authorizations, that basically says what I get to do in a computer system. So an Active Directory or any of the other common access systems that are out there, we're going to have permissions either as users, as administrators, or as people who aren't supposed to be participating in the system at all. And that'll basically tell us what level of privilege that we have in the environment. And then the last thing is accounting or an audit trail. So if I am who I say I am, and authorizations say what I'm allowed to do, then the audit trail keeps track of what I have done, right? And that's very useful and very important for people who implement access control systems. So there we go for that. All right. So at a very high level, there's going to be a number of use cases that we're going to hit. We're going to start by talking through the basic environment setup, what you get out of the box, how it performs out of the box. We're going to talk about how to share content. How in a typical customer environment, we're going to share our content. And how we keep control of what we create without granting access to others. We're going to talk through exclusive access, basically if I'm working on something that I need only people in my role to be able to see. we're going to talk through multi-tenancy and multi-service, and this is one of the most interesting parts of RBAC for my own perspective. Now, it's going to take us a little while to get down to that part of it, but I got to tell you guys, it's probably one of the most powerful ways that BladeLogic is used both within enterprises and within service providers. When we get there, make sure to see what in there can apply to your environment. Accountability we just talked about, you know, who's done what and where. Very important when we're working on large-scale production systems. And then lastly, we're going to talk about Active Directory and LDAP integration. Very common subject. Pretty much, you know, most enterprises that are running any decent amount of Windows are probably going to run into this. I'd say a non-Active Directory environment is probably the exception rather than the rule these days. So we're going to need to be able to talk to that as well. All right. So let's talk about. We're going to talk about some of the challenges that RBAC is traditionally used to address. Now, the probably the most common, let's say, moderate use case is the app release management type use case, right? Basically, where somebody creates some content. They either create a software package, a compliance policy, maybe a shell script that's going to go do something, right? And traditionally, that content, you know, aside from a pure operational organization, is probably going to be created by somebody who doesn't have full access to production. It's going to need to be tested somewhere, at least a little bit, probably on a small subset of dev servers, and then it's going to need to get promoted and handed off to other people who can consume it once it's been tested and verified to do what we want it to. Once it has been tested, you know, in order for that testing to be valid and to mean something, it's definitely helpful to be able to secure it so that unexpected changes can't be made to it. And then once it's deployed in production, or once we're going to deploy it in production, we want to make sure that again, it can't be changed. At the same time, we have different levels of trust. So some people are going to have full access to most servers. Those are going to be the sysadmin type roles. Most of the people on this bridge, if you guys have access to BLadmin's role or a Windows sysadmin or Unix sysadmin or whatever role, you probably have relatively full access to most servers. And so you're saying, all right, well, why do I care about RBAC? Well, not everybody does, right? There's going to be some people in your environment that are going to have full access to a set of servers, right? So these may be developers. They may have a handful or more than a handful of servers that they specifically own, or they have responsibility for it. And so within BSA, they're going to need to have the access to own those configurations, own those servers. But at the same time, you don't necessarily want them to have the same level of privilege on systems that they don't own. Some will have limited access to most servers. If we want to think of, IT security, may want to have read-only access for checking compliance to the broad environment, right? They may need to be able to go look at specific security configurations on every server in the enterprise environment, or even in multiple customer environments. At the same time, those who maintain specific agents, say backup agents or monitoring or performance or any sort of little agents, they may need to operate as a root or an administrator, but only within a narrow scope. Maybe only within the directory that their application operates on. Maybe only within a few specific configuration files in etc or equivalent. And again, you'll also have some people who will have limited access to a few servers. So there may be app administrators who may need access to look at logs, look at configurations, how a given application is set up in production. Anytime an escalation comes through from an app owner and they say, all right, well, the app's not working in production, what's wrong with it? The first answer comes back, well, show me how it's set up, and let's see what's different about the configuration there versus what's in our development environment where the app is working. So obviously there's a range of trust levels, a range of access levels that people need to have in the environment, and it's important to recognize these different levels of access. and it's we're going to need to be able to grant access along these lines, right? So, quick architecture review. We're gonna step through a couple of things. We got to remember that requests are going to come from either the GUI or the shell or the CLI. They're going to go to the app server, and then they're going to talk to the agent, right? Shell requests are going to go through an NSC proxy app server. GUI traffic is going to go through a config server. The all app server includes a config server. And all authentication is going to be basically done at this level between the client and the app server. The agents then hold specific access controls, who can connect. In many environments, only the app servers are allowed to connect to the agents at all. The agents will also control which roles, will also hold configs that define which roles map to which local administrator accounts. The next thing they're going to do is they're going to define how you get mapped in. So if you're a database administrator, you may need to map as root, but you're more likely going to map into an application-specific role, right, or an application-specific account. If you don't have defined access, you may either be refused entirely or mapped to a non-privileged role. So authentication done between the GUI and the app server. Connections traditionally will go through the app servers. And then the agents themselves hold these access controls. That's going to be important later because we're going to talk about how these access controls get out to the agents. All right, so let's talk about objects real quick. So what are roles, right? This thing is called role-based access control. Roles are the central and biggest configuration object here. A role is basically the combination of what users are in that role and then what is that role authorized to do. It says what is all that this role can do. And at the same time, then access control is further granted or revoked down at the object level. But if you for example have blinders on and you're not allowed to do anything with component templates to begin with, it doesn't matter if the object gives you permissions. If your role won't let you work with components, then you're not ever going to be able to see them. The phrase we traditionally use when talking about configuring authorizations and role-based access control is, how big is my world? What do I know about? How free am I to roam around and go do things, or am I kind of locked down into a narrow spot where I got to do what I got to do? All right. So users are going to correspond. I think that one's pretty straightforward. Usually have to do with an actual person or a service account that logs into BladeLogic. And then there are things that are authorizations. We talked about authorizations real briefly right up front. It's basically the specific things that you're allowed to do on a remote, with a server or an object. So there's two types. One are commands. These are pretty straightforward, explicit lists of network shell commands that you can use on a remote system. So you may be allowed to do ls. You may be allowed to do more. You may be allowed to look at things. But maybe you're not allowed to remove things. Maybe you're not allowed to overwrite things. This can be done down at the command level. For those who have a need for this, they can be very, very powerful, but there's also some work to setting it up. The other major type of authorization is systems authorizations. These are specific authorizations. I think there's, Mike, what are there? More than 400 at this point, right? Sound about right? Systems authorizations. These are specific things that you can allow or not allow your users to do based on different types of objects and different actions that you're going to take. And we're going to go look at some specific things around there. So you may be able to look at servers if you have server.read, but if you don't have server.add, you may not be able to add new servers into BladeLogic. You may not be able to decommission servers from BladeLogic. So these specific systems authorizations are going to give you permissions to do or not do a number of different tasks. All right, so we've got our authorizations, right? And so when we, working with these things, you can see that they're very, very granular. They allow you to do very specific things. And rather than sitting here and thinking through every time, okay, which specific authorizations do I want to use? We've got what are called authorization profiles. They're a way to roll up a number of objects into a functional description. So for example, if you have an authorization profile called executes shell scripts, it may consist of somewhere between 3 and 15 or more specific single authorizations that will all roll up to functionally allow you to do the same thing. And there's a bunch of great sample stuff that gets built in the product that will show you how to do this stuff. So once you've got your authorization profiles, you can use what are called ACL templates. And they're basically a way to use the same authorizations over and over again, right? They'll basically roll up this set of them. Think of the profiles as being a way to group things together by activities. Then the ACL templates are basically going to be when we create a new object, when we import a new object, or if we want to apply a set of permissions, basically grant access to an object, or maybe even restrict access to an object, what permissions do we want that object to end up with? And the way that we roll those up is what's called an ACL template. I tend to think of it as a stencil. If you've got a stencil that you're going to lay out and you want to basically do the same thing over and over again, you're basically going to have a specific pattern cut in a sheet of paper. You're going to use some paint. You're going to spray right through the stencil, and you're going to get the same result every time. And that's what ACL templates are very, very useful for. The trick to it is that ACL templates are basically configured when you use them. So when we apply an ACL template, we're going to go look at what permissions are applied by those templates, apply them at the time. But if the ACL template changes later, it's not going to go back and update all of the objects that we've already worked on, right? That's where an ACL policy comes into place. An ACL policy, basically a policy-based way of applying permissions. It's a way of using this specific set of permissions that we want to use, and we're basically going to set a pointer. We're going to set, we're basically going to say this object is going to use the BL admins policy or the enterprise level objects policy. And the thing that's great about it is you can associate it with an object once, and then if the contents of that policy change later, well, all the objects that that policy has been applied to get updated automatically. They basically, instead of having these specific authorizations be set once, and then if they change later, you're going to get that policy set on them, and you basically never have to touch it again. If you're going through and having a lot of repermissioning of objects, or having to change things a lot, that's something that you can definitely look at that will help you solve your problems. All right, so ACL templates and ACL policies are basically consist of a combination of the auth profiles, right, the specific set of permissions, plus role information. So an auth profile by itself just says what kinds of permissions, and then when we build the template, we say, all right, which of these permissions and which roles get those permissions. So we may want to grant more permissions to one role than another, or, for example, an auditor or inspector role may only need read-only access to some objects. All right, great. The last big part of this is object permissions, right? Who's allowed to access the object? So everybody has keys, but only my family has keys to my house, right? I see a lot of customers trying to set up very complicated roles, setting very specific permissions at the role level. But at the end of the day, just like any other computer system, a lot of the direct access to one object over another is done at the object level. Basically, for deploy packages that need to be used across the enterprise, you may want to have relatively open read permissions, but you may only have one or two roles that are allowed to modify that object. At the same time, for objects that I'm creating and I haven't necessarily tested to make sure that they're safe enough for everybody else to be able to use, I may not want to share those out so that everybody else can see them. If it's something that maybe isn't working 100% correctly yet, I may want to keep it in my role until I've gone through some testing and verified that it should be shared to everybody else. And of course, the big question is, where can I see some samples? The thing that's great is Sivan Lahav and Anthony Bryce and some other really great people have made some fairly recent updates to BL content. If you're not on 8.2 yet, or if you haven't run it since prior to 8.2, there's a bunch of great permissions in the BL content. I wouldn't necessarily recommend running it in your production environment if you do have a lab environment, because it is going to go and create a bunch of RBAC objects. But what it'll do is it'll set up sample configurations in all of these classes, all these different types of objects, and you can get a sense of a bunch of things that you can go do in the product. Very nice, very straightforward, very easy way to go understand how to use RBAC. All right, so from an implementation perspective, yep, and I got a blank slide there. I got 3 blank slides there. All right, so from an implementation perspective, we're going to talk about how ACLs are set up. We're going to talk about how they're used in the GUI, and then we're going to talk about how they're actually rolled out on the agents. And we're also going to talk about how connections are made to the network shell proxy, and how connections are then made out to the agent from there. So there's basically a bunch of different authentication types. Secure remote password is the default out-of-the-box one. It's very basic, very straightforward. Specific, user accounts and passwords are configured in user accounts and passwords are configured in BladeLogic. They stay in BladeLogic and they're maintained there. Next, one of the most common integrations is done with Active Directory, where both role user membership is synced over into Active Directory, and authentication can also be done to Active Directory. There are other configurations, including the RSA Secure ID token, LDAP, and a couple others. There's a great doc on it right here that I can point you to. There's some setup to all of those integrations, but as of, I think even 8.1 and later, but definitely 8.2 and later, the Active Directory authentication setup is very straightforward. There's then an individual command that does the sync from Active Directory into roles, and that's pretty straightforward as well. So roles basically map to specific users out on endpoints, but sometimes you need a little more, right? Sometimes you need to map to a domain account. Sometimes you need to, instead of doing impersonation, you may need to actually do a higher level of interaction, for example, to install a SQL server and a few other things where you need to do some domain interaction. You may need a higher level of access control. That's where automation principles get into. And we can go look in the GUI if we get some time at the end and show how to do this. But basically, there's a great doc on automation principles that I'll make sure is available to you guys. They're also used for agent installs and bundles. When you want to go do automated agent installations, automation principles are also used here. And again, anything that uses a real local user. All right. So let's talk about roles. So who do I map to on a given managed server? So roles, at their most fundamental level, this is where roles start. Out of the box, if you don't run BL content, if you don't set up any other roles, you're basically going to have 2 major roles, RBAC admins and BL admins. And so the BL admins role by default, we call it the full administrator, the root equivalent within BladeLogic. And by default, most customer environments are going to map to whatever their local admin account is or to root, right? Once we get beyond the initial, out-of-the-box configuration, we're going to want to map other user accounts in, and we're going to want to map them into specific application roles or into their own local user accounts. But 2 of the most common are to map people into an Oracle or WS admin or Patrol or a specific application admin. Net backup admins will often map into root, but plenty of other applications have dedicated application accounts. So when we set up roles, you have the ability to use either auth profiles or individual authorizations. I've been on a number of calls with users in the last couple of months, and they've been sitting here, hand-picking individual authorizations. I got to tell you guys, if you can use the auth profiles, and setting up your roles, your life's going to be a lot simpler. Even if it means that, for specific use cases, you need to go sit down and calculate out what specific authorizations are needed to do a different task for you. Your life's going to be a lot simpler if you use the auth profile object within BladeLogic to group those tasks together. That'll make it real easy to say, all right, if I want to go do a given activity, this is the auth profile I'm going to use. Next big thing is the default permissions template. This is basically a specific set of tackles that are going to be created on every object you create. We talked about roles that need to share content, and we talked about roles that need to keep their own content. By default, any object I create is going to have no permissions on it, or it's going to have full access for my role, and then it's going to share access. It's going to share access to everybody else who's in BladeLogic. Now, there's going to be a number of specific use cases where I'm either going to not want to share stuff, or I'm going to want to basically keep stuff to myself. Now, what's handy about that is in our default ACL template, if we want to share stuff with everybody in our environment or with another specific role, rather than every time I create an object going and setting those permissions, if I put what I want those permissions to be right into my template, it'll just get set for me automatically. A couple other things about roles. We've gone through a number of iterations in a number of customer environments, and basically they seem to come back to a number of meta roles. There are a lot of jobs that may have some specifics about it, but they're basically going to have different functional levels, right? They're going to have a read-only level where they just need to be able to look at stuff or inspect stuff or go look at things on end servers or in the depot. There's going to be a packager role that's going to pick objects up off of a server and orient them or configure them or make some sort of configuration ready for the deployers to use. The deployers may not necessarily need to be able to build the packages, but they are going to go use them. People in NOC roles are very commonly in this type of role or in specific application release roles. And then the most common role that we see in the environment outside from the read-only role is the sysadmin or full admin role. And this is where systems admins are going to basically need full unfettered access to either a subset of servers or to all of the servers in their environment. You guys can probably see how that solves some different problems. And then lastly is the RBAC admin. The RBAC admin is basically, there are a number of customers that have basically replicated this for different subparts of their environment, but it's basically a role that owns the security configuration within BladeLogic. So the next thing that will happen is, if your common roles are read-only, packager, deployer, and full admin, in multi-service or multi-tenant environments, customers will often go set up 2 or 3 of these roles for each application or service. That can get to be a lot of roles, but it very nicely solves the problem of having users in a read-only role versus having full admin access. We're going to talk about that in some great detail in the advanced stuff, and we can certainly talk about it in greater depth during Q&A. And I'm sure we've got some people who are participating in this that can make some commentary. So what's the detail? So if you have people right now who are going out and logging into specific accounts and then SUing over to these application-specific roles, this role-based access may completely replace those local user accounts on the different systems. I know at a number of our larger enterprise accounts, customers are looking to get out of the business of maintaining local user accounts on the systems. This is a great way to approach that. There's also the ability to root or basically lock a given user into a given directory. So you may give the net backup administrator full unrestricted access as root, but only to the directory that his application lives in. So the worst damage he can do is blow up the backup agent. And lastly, one that was mentioned on a call I just got off of before getting into this one is, of course, time windows. You can have a role that has full administrative access, 9 to 5 in their local time zone. And then outside of those time zones, and especially outside of maintenance windows, they do not have access to those servers. Very handy. All right. So users, like we said, the out-of-the-box authentication is traditionally secure remote password. Very straightforward protocol, definitely gets the job done. Next most common thing to do is, of course, LDAP sync. That also covers Active Directory. And it basically will map the LDAP containers into the roles and add and remove user accounts as they move within those containers. That is done on a time basis, so however often you want to run that is however often you can sync them over. And then there's, of course, Active Directory authentication, where you authenticate to Active Directory. So you can use, in many customer environments, it seems that that's commonly spoken about by the name of the domain in a customer environment. So ours happens to be AD-prods. We talk about using your AD-prod password. There's a few specific tools that are very handy for the end user. Reconnect. So if you close your laptop, go home, dial back in on the VPN, you're probably going to want to reconnect your session. If you want to change roles, you don't have to go all the way outside of BladeLogic. You can just do switch role, and it will dump all of the cache and all of the session information that you have. Can be very handy when you're testing something. And then it'll just basically map you over into your new role. And then lastly, of course, everybody needs to be able to change their password. All right, so let's talk about access controls. So in the exports file, the default configuration is *RW. And that basically will allow all clients to connect and basically, unless the no user account is present, or unless the no user configuration is in the user's file, will let you come in and map as basically nobody. Not an awful configuration, but probably not something that most enterprises want to have by default. So, I'll usually start people as *RO, lets people come in only as read-only, and then what many customers will do is they'll put explicit entries in their exports file that will only allow specific IP addresses to come in. So you may identify your application servers, you may figure out what the IPs that are going to be on for the next 3 years, put them on those IPs, and then put entries in the exports file to only allow connections in. It's also going to require setting up NSH proxy if you're a heavy network shell user, so that's something to consider as well. But this is a great configuration that's definitely common across the environment. We are not probably going to be able to get into talking about certificates today unless you've got a lot of questions. If you do have a lot of questions about certificates, please register in the Q&A, and we'll make sure to make some time for them. So the next big configure file is the users.local file. So this is a static file. You basically set it up, it sits where it sits, and shouldn't get touched by any automated process that we use. And I consider it the fail-safe, right? It basically is what will let me or a given specific user account back into the system if I do manage to screw up my access controls in other ways. Traditionally, you'll have, in the older roles, in the older environments, you'll have BLadmins : then a username or 2 usernames. As of, I think, 8.1 or 8.2, or maybe even older, we support the :* configuration. And what that basically means is anybody who connects through who has been authenticated as being in the BLadmins role, any of those users will get mapped in correctly. And then you're just responsible for maintaining it at the app server level. Very handy, very simple configuration. BLadmins : map it to whatever the correct user account is, and then it's very difficult to lock that role accidentally out of your environment. The users file then is the main one that access controls live in out on the agents. It is updated, as we say, by the push ACL's job. So what this does is this basically propagates out the permissions that are defined in the roles and on the server objects. And this is basically going to take those permissions that are in the GUI. It'll see how they apply to the environment. It'll see what user account you rolled, what user account your role is mapped to, and then we'll map those out into a bunch of specific configurations that will go into the user's file. Anybody who's probably played with RBAC in any extensive amount has seen this, but this is basically how permissions get out to the agents from the app server. You can grant all the access in the world you want in the UI, but until you push those ACLs out to the agents, you're not going to have any access to the agents themselves. I've had several questions around no user. I want to make sure we cover it comprehensively so that there's no questions about it. If the no user configuration exists in the user's file, then you will only be allowed access to the agent if you are explicitly mentioned in either the users or users.local file. If the no user configuration does not exist and you're not listed in those files, you're going to be mapped to anonymous or nobody access. Check the documentation on this, but if you have questions, what this basically says is no unauthorized users will be allowed to connect at all. All right, and the last one is don't push ACLs to your file server. Don't push ACLs to your application servers. When you're doing push ACLs and when you're putting together the push ACLs jobs, make yourself a server smart group that explicitly excludes your infrastructure and don't push ACLs to your file server. It'll make a lot of things break very, very quickly, and I can't count the number of times that I've sat down with a customer, worked through some problem they're having, only to find out that the ACLs got pushed to the file server. My friends Omar and Mohammed are particularly familiar with this one. All right, so we talked through how that works. We're going to end up talking through the service provider model here at some point. We're going to talk about how to manage access to different environments, and we're going to talk about how to manage access through firewalls. All right, so what's the out-of-the-box behavior at a high level? Out of the box, when you set up BladeLogic, you're basically going to get two roles and two user accounts, BL admins, BL admin, and RBAC admins, RBAC admin. The objects that you create are generally going to be visible to others. It's generally a sharing model out of the box, but obviously if you're looking at this webinar, you're probably interested in doing more than that. As we said, BL content will build out the sample roles and the sample auth profiles after the install. If you have not run this in a while, I strongly recommend considering it, looking at it. At a minimum, run it in a lab environment to get some exposure to how these configurations are set up. When we do PSCs, we'll just run BL content and then rename the sample content because there's some really great examples that have been tested a bunch of times in there that solve some very specific problems. But like we said, by default, you're going to own the stuff that you've got, and then you're going to need to be able to explicitly grant it over to another role. All right, so let's talk about use cases. So when we go create content, so that's what? That's a script, that's a package, that's a policy, a component template, whatever gets created. How does it get permissions? It's going to get its permissions from the default ACL template, from the specific template that says, here's what permissions I want to create my objects with. Now, out of the box, if I'm in the Unix admins role and I go create an object, it's going to have full permissions for Unix admins, and then everyone else is going to have read. And so that'll let them look at the object, and that'll let them use that object for their deploy jobs, but they won't be able to make any changes to it, right? So very helpful, very functional sort of default configuration, but still secure enough that it's not completely wide open, right? You're not going to accidentally change somebody in a different role's content. One of the big questions we get, how do I set those permissions? So once I know what permissions I want across a folder, across all the objects in that folder, there is a right-click, apply permissions. And so the thing to remember is if you want to go set permissions, you're going to need the permissions to access those objects to begin with, right? So BL admins traditionally has permissions to change a bunch of to set permissions. RBAC admins as well. But if you want to go fixed permissions, the way you do it is with right-click Apply Permissions. And make sure to check the recurse if you want it to go all the way down. When you do want to share content with others, when you want to give them right access to your objects, they're one of the most common use cases that we see is where 2 or 3 or 4 roles want to be able to share access to some content maybe, and all be able to edit that content, but they may then only want to have individual access to their servers. What you can do is you can set the permissions so that when you create an object, you grant, say, BL package.modify or some sort of write permissions to those other roles, and all that stuff goes in your default ACL template. Obviously, there are a few roles that are going to want to keep their content private from spying eyes, and so the most common thing to remove is the everyone.read, the everyone role, and then read authorization. So maybe everyone.blpackage.read, but whatever those read permissions are, you take them out of their templates, and everything they create will only be seen to them until they change the permissions on the objects. Probably not something you want to do as a default unless you need to, because it can be very tedious to maintain those objects afterwards, but very common configuration for specific use cases. And then the last one, the next major one is accountability. Who accessed what, when did they do, and from where? So there's basically 3 major parts to this. The first one, obviously, is the RCD log out on the remote target. So when we're talking about servers, server access is done in the rcd.log. All of the connections that are going to come in are going to have a specific format. It'll be very easy and straightforward to see. The NSH proxy is going to record incoming connections and authorizations. And then lastly is the audit trail in the GUI on a given specific object. All right. So we talked kind of obliquely about content development, what we call classic app release management. When you run BL content, it'll go build the templates required to do promote to QA, promote to prod. We talk about developer creating a bit of content and then promoting it. QA is going to test it through deployment. The important thing to remember is with formal app release management, with a formal app release process, the developer traditionally is the only person who touches the contents of the package itself. They're the person who knows what they're doing with the package. They're the person who should be working on it. Once the developer promotes that package, they're going to give up permissions. They're going to basically take away permissions for anybody else to change the contents of that package. What next is going to happen is when QA deploys and when production deploys, they're going to deploy it, and it's either going to work or it's not going to work. And if it doesn't work, they're going to roll it back, and they're going to demote it back down to QA. And then once it passes, once the developer does what they need to do, they're going to promote it up to QA. QA deploys it. It passes. Then they're going to promote it up to production. Production can deploy it out to their environment. What this does is this locks down the package. It locks down the content that we move through the environment, right? And what problem does it solve? It makes sure that when the developer says, oh, that broke, oh, we'll go change this configuration, right? Instead of QA having to go make those changes in the package, which, they may be right, but, if there's an error there, at that point you've removed a QA, okay? So there was a problem promoting, there was a problem deploying into QA. Who's to say that you won't have the same problem going into production? All right, so again, we talked about Active Directory and LDAP synchronization. I consider it to be a basic use case, pretty straightforward, pretty common to stand up. Let's see. But, definitely something that everybody wants to be able to do. How do the authorizations work when importing or exporting? So when an object is exported, because exports are usually done across environments and because RBAC is rarely the same between environments, we're going to drop the permissions when we export, and then we'll go reset them when we import. So which role imports an object will govern, just like if you were going to go create an object from scratch, on import, you're going to set permissions on that object. All right, and then we talked about mapping all of the users in the DB admin's role to a specific application ID like Oracle or all the people in the WebSphere admins to a WS admin or whatever it happens to be, or for your specific in-house custom apps. It gives you a great way to have a bunch of users able to access objects on a remote server without having to manage specific OS permissions, and gives you great accountability over who did what. All right, so we're going to talk about multi-tenant in some greater depth here a little bit later, but multi-customer within a given enterprise is basically talking about one of these subsets of access to servers. So the email admins are going to need access to different boxes than the web admins or the web app admins. They're going to probably need to only see their specific server smart groups and servers. Permissions for this are usually managed at both the group and smart group level and at the server level. So just because you give somebody access to a specific subset of server smart groups or server groups, you need to make sure to also set those permissions at the server level. Otherwise, the users can just build a new server smart group and they'll find those other servers. We've seen this happen in a number of cases. It's some great hygiene that you can do to be careful. Be careful with how you're setting up your permissions on your servers. But we talk about people getting easily confused within the UI. Here's an easy way to simplify it, right? If the email admins can only see their Exchange servers, if the web app groups can only see their servers, a lot easier to navigate. They're going to see server names that they recognize and not get lost in the UI. And so that's basically set with permissions on those top-level server smart groups, and then obviously on the servers and objects themselves. All right, so these aren't necessarily super advanced use cases, but they're things that, unless you have a need for, you may not go set up, right? So the first one we're going to talk about is access to one or a few objects. There's a way to use a component template that we will commonly show when we're working through RBAC. You can use a component template and a component to give access to a given administrator for an application to as few as one configuration entry and one configuration file on as many servers as they want. What's more common is to give access to a directory or to a specific configuration file. Now, what's awesome about this is this gives you the ability to give all of the power of snapshot, audits, all of the rules-based compliance and so forth to a given application configuration as root across as few or as many servers as you want to, basically in a controlled fashion, right? And this is great for app owners, right? You get people who own either third-party applications, infrastructure agents, or in-house built applications. You say, all right, I'm going to give you full access to your application wherever it lives in production, and I'm going to give it to you as basically a privileged account, but you won't be able to accidentally screw anything else up in the environment. So this can be very powerful. That's traditionally done through a component template. The component template specifies the few configurations that you're going to grant access to, and then you're going to use, Discovery Job and some of those other things to go out and find the servers on which it applies. Some of that stuff's been covered in previous webinars. Next standard use case, access to those dev servers for the developers or the engineers. All right, here's the 7 boxes in development that are an instance of your application. You get full access on them. Go do anything you want to. And then when you want to go push changes from development up to production, make sure to package whatever changes you made. Pretty straightforward. There's going to be a lot of app owners in your environment that have their servers, and they're going to want to have access to their servers without having to hassle anybody else. This is critical path, right? We got to make sure that that in order to get their buy-in to use a tool like this, we're going to need to be able to give them full permissions within their subset of servers. At the same time, we have a responsibility to make sure they don't touch the rest of the environment. Read-only access is root, kind of a subset of these two previous steps. We're going to give app owners, sometimes fairly privileged access, but we want it to be read-only, right? We want them to be able to look but not touch. And that, again, is going to use component templates and some specific server authorizations where you're gonna give somebody maybe server read and server browse, but not not modify and create and stop and start service. All right, so let's talk about multi-tenant use. So service providers, I haven't looked at the Q&A list, or at the participant list, but I know we have a number of major service providers, including Xerox, Accenture, TCS, HCL, and of course other service providers within the organization. The big use case for service providers is basically multi-tenancy. If we're going to give our end users access to this application, why wouldn't we want to, right? Or if we're going to use this application, BladeLogic, to manage our customer environments in a service provider environment, we need to be able to appropriately segregate, and we need to be able to appropriately assign permissions to these end users. Traditionally, there are, just as with multi-service, multiple roles per customer. Customers are traditionally defined through the customer property. It's an out-of-the-box config. You don't have to use that specific property, but many customers do, where you basically use that to tag different servers and say, all right, you belong to the shoe company, or you belong to the energy company, or you belong to the telecommunications company. And, we're going to use that property to group those servers. You may have many roles that need, for example, read-only access to a patch catalog. They may need read-only access to patches. They may need read-only access to a standard security policy. But you wouldn't necessarily want every app owner out in the world to be able to go in and modify your security policy. So they will end up with read access. They may occasionally share access to some objects, and that's all done through RBAC. Very common use case is different admin accounts. I know a number of our larger financial customers have gone through pretty significant acquisitions. Even when I was working at a small insurance company in Milwaukee, we had 600 servers, and we bought another company that had 400 servers. And the challenge there was their servers had a different admin account than ours, of course, because Microsoft's best practice is to change the admin account, but they don't say what to change it to, because obviously that would be self-defeating. But we're going to need to be able to map different servers to different admin accounts. There is a parameter in the role screen that will let you parameterize which roles to map to based on a server name. Or based on a server property. And so what you can do is you can go smart group together all of the boxes that belong to company 1 and all the boxes that belong to company 2 in 2 different groups, and go set what the admin account should be on both of those environments. And then it's very, very straightforward to just start rolling forward with using those accounts. Now, as you align those administrator accounts, you may want to have your Windows admins role, and then you may want to have your legacy Windows admins role or your new company Windows admins role, and have them specifically just aligned to each of those admin accounts. And as you go through and rename the admin account, of course, as soon as you rename the admin account, a role that was mapping to the old user isn't going to map to anything useful anymore. So it's helpful to already have that new role set up and those access controls pushed out to the target. Obviously, the parameterized admin account, as we were talking about above, helpful when there's more than one admin account. We do have a few customers that have a different local admin account on every single server in their environment. You wouldn't be able to cope with that if you didn't have the ability to do parameterized admin. So that's a very nice solution to that problem, where you can basically go set those from a properties file or from an automated process to define what the admin account needs to be on those servers. True rooted access, partial access on sensitive servers. We will sometimes give app owners full run of the logs directory. We will generally avoid giving them the nexec command authorization. We may give them a handful of specific authorizations that allow them a limited access. The thing that's, I have looked at this a number of times, and I've asked myself, well, why would you even bother with this? The thing that it comes back to is, if you can give people specific, very secure configurations to a given list of servers, you can give them relatively broad access as long as you know that it's only going to go to a certain point and no further. It can be very, very powerful. Obviously, limited NSH remote access is done that way, is done through, basically hand-selecting configurations. I wouldn't say it's extremely common, but it's definitely popular in a certain type of security environment where we give people access to some things but not others. This can be very handy for a particularly persistent app owner who wants access or wants visibility to a number of things. This lets you grant it to them without having to fight extensively with InfoSec. If you say they can only look at this subset of configurations and they can only run these commands, and you can demonstrate how that's true, it tends to be very popular with InfoSec. And so again, all of this stuff has to do with, these middle two have to do with specific command authorizations. And we talked about many users in a role. All right. So there were questions on imports and exports. When you go import an object as of at least 8.2 and later, you're going to be able to explicitly map your permissions on those imports. You're going to be able to say what permissions you want to set on those objects as you import them. I'd still definitely recommend using the default ACL templates. They're going to set what your default permissions are, especially if you're doing something over and over again, especially if you're doing it in an automated fashion. But that's your opportunity to set permissions on those objects. We talked a little bit about time window-based access, so you may actually give a role only access during a maintenance window. I know we have a financial company in the Midwest that basically locks down their entire environment before 4 o'clock Central. 4 o'clock Central, 5 o'clock Eastern, basically after the markets close. So they don't get to they cannot touch their trading platform during trading hours. Makes a lot of sense, right? If your business lives and dies by your trading platform, you don't want changes being made to it during the day except in emergencies. So most of their roles are set up to basically only be able to access servers during those maintenance windows. We get a lot of requests for temporary access, basically where you grant access for a window of time to a given server or subset of servers, and then you're going to remove that access. If done in a completely automated fashion, it's traditionally done through the CLI, and it can often be aligned with a specific change request where the customer may say, all right, I need to go grant this user full access to this box, and that's traditionally done through the command line. So moving into automation, moving into talking about automation from the command line, tying into different orchestration systems. I'm out in the San Francisco Bay Area this week, and we have a number of customers out here who are using different orchestration solutions, including BMC's Atrium Orchestrator. There are a couple of different ways to handle this. So when you authenticate on the command line, you're basically going to go get a credential, and that credential is going to be usable for a certain window of time, right? And that makes an awful lot of sense for an individual end user, right? You're going to do what you're going to do. You're going to authenticate, and then you're going to want to be done. But for orchestration, it can sometimes be helpful to set a much longer credential if you don't want to have to re-authenticate or test whether your authentications are working on every execution of your workflow. So it's not uncommon for customers to set their credentials to live quite a bit longer than the default. Those of you who work long hours, as I do, and I'm sure most of you do as well, will notice that there's a specific timeout for the GUI. This can be set to be longer if you traditionally work longer than a 10-hour day. But these timeouts are definitely something that as you get to be a heavier and heavier user of BladeLogic, you may want to be able to configure or reconfigure. All right, so that kind of wraps use cases at a high level. There's some specific node issues and risks. So when you put host entries in the exports file, we definitely prefer to use IP addresses if at all possible. I can't tell you the number of customers where we figured out that name resolution didn't work on their endpoint because they had host names with names in the exports file rather than IP addresses. If there's any possibility that your agent will not correctly look up reverse DNS, you know, definitely lean towards using IP addresses. We've had a number of agent stability tickets filed. Go to find out that those boxes aren't able to actually resolve those names. The ACLs are read on every new agent connection, so try to keep them at a reasonable size. The performance of BSA ACL policies. The ACL policies are one of the most powerful things in RBAC, but it unfortunately does not perform terribly well prior to the 8.2 GA release. So if you want to get heavily into this and you're not on 8.2, let's get you upgraded to 8.2 first. If you're having problems with that or you need some help, please reach out. We'll get you sorted out. Lastly, I'm going to say this several times through this presentation, please do not push ACLs to the file server. If you need to have an agent on the BladeLogic infrastructure to manage it as a managed target, and I would encourage you to be very careful with that. If you do need to have agents on the app server, make sure to go set up a second agent to act as the file server. And there's some coverage of that in the original deployment architecture discussion. But if you push ACLs to the file server, then different roles will create different files on the file server as different users. They'll have different permissions, and we definitely don't want you to have to maintain those by hand on the file server. That's just a non-starter. All right, reporting. There's some great documentation around how the built-in RBAC reports. So, you know, we see there's a range of objects here. We see that they interact in a number of different ways. We need to know what we need to know how those objects, you know, what mappings are allowed there, and our information security groups are going to want to see that content, and they're going to want to be able to see who's got access to what and how. There are a bunch of RBAC reports built into BladeLogic. There's also some great documentation in the BDSSA doc around the information that's available in those domains. We have a few customers that need more than this, but for most users, this should pretty comprehensively cover what you need to see. It's also very handy to be able to go, there's a couple of different tricks in the UI that will show the effective permissions, basically show what permissions are set on a given object, or you know, given all of the different, you know, sometimes confusing authorization profiles and policies that apply to a box. The show effective permissions button is basically going to let you evaluate all of those and see what permissions are actually in place at any given time on a given object. So pretty handy little tool. Definitely make sure to check it out, especially if you're doing a decent amount of testing. All right. So you're like, all right, that's great. I don't know that I've ever seen RBAC in the GUI, right? The first place to look for it is at the top of the screen. So in the status bar, you're going to see the role you're in. I usually work in BL admin because I'm lazy. The user that you're logged in as, I usually use the BL admin account because I'm usually working in a lab, but you're probably going to have your user account. And then the name of the app server that you're plugged into, right? There's a permissions pane at the bottom left that's open traditionally in the out-of-the-box UI configuration. There's also an audit trail pane. Both of those are going to show you some detailed stuff around RBAC. And then there's the RBAC workspace. And I've got a graphic of it here in this deck somewhere. It's going to include automation principles. It's going to include all of those different objects that we talked about in the object overview, right? It's going to have those configs down in there, and it's going to kind of show you the way through. It's going to show you the way, you know, how to look at those different objects. Other places, there's also automation principles, as we said, that's under the RBAC workspace, but it's also used in a number of different places in the UI. There's the Unified Agent Installer. The Unified Agent Installer is going to use automation principles to authenticate to remote servers that we're installing agents on. We talked about reconnect, switch role, and change password. And every object that you go through in the UI is basically going to end up having a permissions pane on it. It is very much a RBAC-enabled tool. There are RBAC configurations almost everywhere within the product, and if you're having problems getting and granting permissions to specific users, chances are good there's a way to solve that. All right. So we're basically going to call a pause here, and we're going to get into Q&A. But before we get into the Q&A, I want to talk about the next call we're going to do. Next time we do this, we're going to do this as a 30-minute call instead of an hour-and-a-half call. I know that it's tough for you guys to justify getting time away, and I know that it's tough to justify the time that goes into this. So what we're going to do is we're going to record some of the content, including some live demos, into several videos ahead of the call. And then during the call that we do, we're going to do kind of best of the highlights. We're going to talk about the stuff that's in those calls, but that's going to give you the chance to go look at those demos in advance on your own time. And then if you have questions and answers or questions about that content, you can bring that to the call when we go do it. It should give us a lot more time for Q&A and allow us to have a more focused follow-on discussion than we've been able to for the amount of time committed. All right. So I think that's what I've got for deck. Mike, what does it look like for Q&A? Have we been able to cover most of the Q&A?
Yeah, I think Q&A is good, Sean. Maybe hand it over to Jessica to open up the lines now and see if we have any on the phone.
Sure. So Jessica, we're going to go do that, and then if anybody wants to see some of this stuff in the GUI, we can certainly bring that up as well. So Jessica, go ahead and open up the lines for questions, please.
Certainly. If you would like to ask a question, please signal by pressing *1 on your telephone keypad. If you are using a speakerphone, please make sure your mute function is turned off to allow your signal to reach our equipment. A voice prompt on the phone line will indicate when your line is open. Please state your name before posing your question. Again, press *1 to ask a question. We'll take our first question.
Hello.
Yeah, hi, this is Suresh here.
Hi.
Hi, how are you doing?
Awesome. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the question here is like, I want to know how to automate the agent installation process. So
sure.
This covers two parts, right? Like while you pick up a new host, you install the agent on the host, and then you need to add the host or import the host into BladeLogic, right?
Right.
So the importing part, that's what I'm looking at for automation. And
sure.
then, yeah, okay, you can carry on.
No, go. All right, so there's several moving parts there, right? So if you want to have fully automated, agent acquisition, obviously if you can get an agent on there yourself, that's pretty straightforward, right? That's pretty straightforward. Once you've got the agent on the server, then you're basically using either server add server individually or server bulk add servers. And either way, what you're basically going to do is you're going to basically go, and I love these command line examples that they give us. You're basically going to use the add server command to add a new server into the environment. Now that's very straightforward and very abbreviated. There's obviously much more that can go into that. But once you've got the agent rolled out on it, you can individually add servers through this CLI command. Does that cover the specific question you had?
Yeah, like see, the host that I'm installing the agent, that
sure.
has to contact the BladeLogic server, right? The main server.
Yep.
So how is that going to happen?
So if you're going to do it, so this is something that comes up on a sometimes basis. And basically what this is agents that are self-registering. So because BladeLogic is a speak when spoken to architecture, right? And because in many customer environments we're going to manage servers that for whatever reason can't reach back to the app server infrastructure, Are you building these servers new using provisioning, or are you just deploying agents to existing servers in your environment?
Both are right. Like both are our cases, like new servers as well as existing servers.
Yep. So so let's take the easier one first. Servers that you're building using BladeLogic provisioning.
Not with BladeLogic provisioning.
Okay. All right. So servers that you're not building using automated provisioning, there's a number of different ways to do it, but basically the most common way is to have the remote server check in somehow, right? Now, whether that's making a callback or using wget, making some sort of web request, what we'll commonly see people do is reach out to the report server and basically logs or another web server in your environment, because web traffic tends to be fairly easy to move around within an environment, or either maybe create a file on a common open file share in the company, and then you just have a process go out and find those servers, right? So if you're either looking in a web log or you're looking in a particular shared directory, whatever your mechanism is for check-in, then it's fairly straightforward to hook that into a process that's going to then end up using this call. So I think there's some samples of how to do that on communities in a couple of places. If you can't find those, please do reach out.
Yeah. Okay. So I think currently we're using the same thing, the one that you're told.
Yeah.
Updating a text file using wget and then
Yep.
a scheduled task to add the host.
Yeah. Yeah,
okay.
and that's a very common mechanism. The challenge we run into with it is that so many servers end up being behind DMZs or basically don't have network access back to the core infrastructure that it gets, it tends to be a little more interesting to figure out how to add them. The other thing you can do is if you can query, if they get added to a particular LDAP or Active Directory group, you can dump the list of those out and basically sync them into BladeLogic. But that only obviously works for Windows, right? All right, great.
Yeah.
Jessica, you good?
I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, great. And guys, if you have questions on this stuff, please post in communities. Bill, myself, Tim Byron, John O'Toole, most of the guys in Premier Support do read all the questions that, a lot of the questions that come through communities, and we're happy to have these conversations there and in other places. All right, Jessica, any other callers?
Yes, we'll go to our next question.
Sure.
Mike Jones.
Hello. Mike?
Hi, Sean.
Hi, Mike.
Hi. A question for futures, I guess, on
Sure.
BSA. Are there any thoughts to being able to limit a role? So I work in a service provider environment, and we can have thousands of roles, or we will do eventually. But sometimes, say on a particular customer, they have a set application group that only need access to a small subset of the servers, and the only option is to create a new role and put those users into the role and the associated template. An ideal functionality would be able to restrict to a certain number of users in a role, or to restrict users in a role to a certain number of objects.
Restrict?
Yeah.
Yeah, so...
To get around the fact of having to create a new role every time.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge with it is that all the functionality that you want is basically built into the role definitions, right?
Yeah. But we could have a standard role, admin role.
Right.
But you want different users to have that role on the different objects without a copy of that role, effectively.
Yeah, and unfortunately, Akbar Aziz, who's our product manager, was unable to join us today. Had a thing. He would be a great guy to talk about features and talk about how to do this. But if you want to shoot an email over to himself and myself, or to Mike Vela, or to anybody on this thing, especially, if you want to open it. I know nobody likes to open tickets, but they are the best way to track this sort of thing. But if you want to start an email conversation with us, I'm sure we can discuss that in some greater length. In the short term, I realize it's tedious to maintain a lot of roles, and I know in some of our larger customers we do have, several hundred roles. But in the short term, aside from just managing the number of roles, man, it does do exactly what you're looking for, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It's just the number of roles that's
Yeah. Yeah, it would be nice. It would be nice if you could if you could just instantiate an app owner role and then have a list of a bajillion of them, right? Have a special type of role.
Yeah.
We'll leave that conversation for talking with product management because fortunately or unfortunately, I'm not a guy who can have that conversation in any great depth. But let's talk about that. Let's talk about that offline.
All right. Thanks.
All right. Thanks. Sorry I don't have a better answer for you. Jessica, who else is looking?
And once again, that is *1 if you would like to ask a question.
Okay.
And there are no questions in queue at this time.
Oh, all right. So let's see. All right, so here's our ACL summary view that shows us what permissions we have on a given object and where those permissions come from. And that's very helpful. That'll give us that. We were talking about that earlier. If nobody else has any other questions, *1 to get in. But we could talk through how to do automation principles. We could talk about who and what and how, and basically.
And we do have a couple of questions.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Yannick, and I would like if you could talk a little bit more about the automation principle. I think that's what you're doing right now, actually.
As a matter of fact.
And a use case on how we can use this, and more importantly, what are the infrastructure requirements to be able to use automation principles?
I'm going to let the panelists ring in on that one, but I think where I traditionally will use automation principles is I'll use them just to gain access to a real user account. So I don't think you even technically need Active Directory, although I think that's the most common place that it's set up. But there's some great out-of-the-box doc that covers. I think I've even got it linked in my discussion over here on automation principles.
Okay.
Yep.
Because we'd like to be able to use this in our environment. We have about close to 70 customers that we manage service for, and some do need local accounts because the impersonalization of BladeLogic is not enough and causes problems, mainly on domain controllers. So using automation principles will help, but we just don't know what we need to implement it, and the documentation covers most of it, but I still had some questions, so maybe I can review this online doc. We're using 8.1 at the moment, so I don't know if there's anything different in 0.2 and forward upon that.
Yeah, so go look at the, let me go find it. So I don't know if you guys, spend a lot of time in docs, but I end up basically favoriting particular areas that I like to go through and have access to. And, of course, I'll use search as well. But, if you guys are looking at this doc and something's not clear to you, please come through. Let's see. Let's go find the 8.2 doc. So if you're looking through stuff and something's not clear to you, like it's not clear how to use it or what's required, there's a comment box right at the bottom of the doc. I think you do have to be logged in to be able to comment, but if something's unclear to you, so what's the short-term concern? You're not clear what's
the requirements in terms of infrastructure, like if we need to have an AD server or an LDAP server or something like that that we need to build because it's not existing at the moment. What kind do we need?
Okay, so if you want to use Active Directory, obviously, let's see, if you want to use automation principles with AD, you do need an AD infrastructure, right?
Obviously, yeah.
But then all you need, as far as I know, all you need for the target server to be a member of that infrastructure. I don't think you need a dedicated AD server in addition to the existing AD infrastructure that your managed targets are a part of. Like I've gone and set this up a few times myself, the automation principles, and as you see with this guy, domain is not a required field. So if you want to use local user accounts or a local admin account, it's just a matter of having the ID and the passphrase defined in the automation principle. So I don't think you even need to have AD if you don't want to use AD, right?
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, Sean, that's correct. You don't, Active Directory isn't required.
Yeah. I think it's the most common implementation, but I don't think it's required, yeah. All right, great.
Okay, thanks, Dennis. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. No problem. Other questions around automation principles?
We'll go to our next question.
Sure, thanks. Hello, caller.
Your line is open.
Hello, this is Pavel with the Healthcare Service Corporation.
Hello, Pavel.
Hi, Yusuf. Nice to hear you. I'm asking the question, and maybe it comes because of some confusion, so my question might be just a stupid question, but I know you like those. So, what's the future of RBAC in the future releases of BSA? Because I know that some things are, at least my understanding was that there were some plans to replace it. If I was wrong, then the answer probably is simple. But if I was not, what is changing there? What are the plans for using some other identification and console access mechanism for BSA?
So I don't think RBAC is gonna. I don't think RBAC in the core product is going to change significantly in the next couple of releases. Again, we don't have product management on, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. They're in the DTA portal, which is targeted for later this year. There's going to be a more simplified access control method for objects only within the portal, but that's not going to change much within BSA.
Okay. And Sean, any plans that RBAC will be integrated with the Atrium SSO or anything like this?
Not that I know of, but I definitely am not I'm definitely not an authority on that.
Okay.
That'd be a great question for Akbar next time we get to talk to him.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Do you have any other questions around RBAC?
No, it was a great introduction. I'm going to dig more into this, Sean.
Awesome.
It was very, very good presentation.
Yeah. All right. So Adonai Cervantes had a specific question for us that I'm going to just handle out of sequence, and that was about what to use in automation principle. So basically, by default, when a role is working on a server, it's going to map to a specific user account, right? So if we go, let's go pick a little more useful role, the BL admin's role. By default, a given role is going to map to a specific user out on a specific server. The other thing, but it does that through impersonation. If it doesn't do it through impersonation, or if impersonation is insufficient for a task that you want to do, like installing SQL Server, right, then you can use an automation principle. And so what that automation principle will let you do is it'll let you actually go do, you see that there's a password in here, but you see that on other role definitions, there's not a password. These use impersonation from the agent itself, and then when we go use the automation principle, this actually does I don't want to say it does a log on, but it basically does a higher level of authentication. All right, great, thanks. But it's basically going to give you a more powerful way to authenticate on a remote target. Obviously, you don't need it for 99% of tasks out there, but man, when you do, you really do. All right, we're getting towards the top. We're getting towards the bottom half of the hour. Michelle, I think we might have time for one more question.
There are no
we can wrap up.
questions in queue at this time.
Awesome. All right, Mike. I think that's a good session. We got a bunch of good information out there. I'm going to apologize in advance that that deck was a little messier than I would have liked. We had a minor software problem, which was completely my fault. But we'll get that cleaned up and posted within the next day. And then if you guys have any questions or concerns, all this stuff ends up out in communities. And I think everybody's sick of me. I think everybody's sick of me talking about all the different places that you can go find best practices webinars, but they are all out on communities. And so I will be posting to the RBAC Best Practices and Use Cases page a cleaned up version of the deck and then the recording of the session absolutely as soon as we have that. And we'll, of course, also be posting it to YouTube. So if there are no further questions or concerns, Mike Fiala?
Yeah, I think we're good, Sean. The link where we're going to be posting this is in the chat, so everyone please check it out. All the past recordings are there as well. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you next month.
All right, thanks, guys, for participating. We're going to make it a little faster for you next time and kind of record this stuff ahead of time so that you don't have to put a solid 90 minutes into it all at once if you don't have to. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.
This does conclude today's conference. Thank you for your participation.
Awesome.